Thank you very much, Jacob, and thank you to the Future of Freedom Foundation for arranging to bring me over to the States. This is only the second time I've been here. I came over last year. I always have a great time, and on the back of being invited, I decided that I would go to New York and go to the Bay Area and meet up with some other people that I knew to try and get the word out about this. And so it's great to be here. The film that we're going to see in a bit is a documentary that I actually started work on 2 years ago with a filmmaker friend, and given all our various other obligations, work and children, and not really having much of a budget for it, it kind of proceeded quite slowly. We've done a lot of work on it this year, and I'm very happy to bring it here now because we finally finished it about a month ago. We've had a screening in London about 2 weeks ago. I've shown it twice in New York in the last few days, and this is the fourth time, I think, now that this film's being shown. So I hope you're going to enjoy it. I've been asked to talk before it, and I think maybe it would make sense if I gave a little story of how I kind of became involved in all of this, and how the film is really part of an ongoing project to chronicle Guantanamo, to tell the stories of the prisoners who are there, and to challenge the lies and misinformation that are produced by the administration, certainly by the Bush administration, and the continuation of some of that by the Obama administration, and some of the very challenging issues that I think that we face with just a couple of months to go before the deadline that President Obama set for the closure of the prison on January the 22nd, 2010. I'd been somebody who had been troubled by Guantanamo from the moment that it opened, and I think the impact of that may have been less had there not been those photos that were released at the very beginning. Photos have an extraordinary power, really. And for somebody who writes so much, I'm kind of disappointed to say that I realize how much power photographs have, rather than necessarily the written word. You know, I think the single most clear insight into some of the most terrible things that have been happening under the Bush administration in the war on terror were the photos that came out of Abu Ghraib. But I think for those who were paying attention from the very beginning, those photos of the guys with the goggles on their eyes and their ears closed and shackled and bound in the orange jumpsuits on the gravel at Guantanamo on the very day that the prison opened sent a powerful message that something really rather extraordinary was happening here, and that it probably really wasn't going to be a very good thing. Now, as we all know, it took a long time really for much information to come out of this essentially secret prison that the Bush administration had established, because they had made this novel and very dangerous decision, one that's taking a lot of time to clear up even now, even with the best will, to hold people who were captured during wartime not as prisoners of war protected by the Geneva Conventions, and also to confuse what was a terrorist attack, which is a criminal act, to confuse that with a war is where I think the whole problem really began. So Guantanamo was established as the most visible front in the war on terror, where the Bush administration declared that it had a right to hold people prisoner in a kind of third category of prisoner, human beings who had absolutely no rights whatsoever. And so, you know, in the early days, what happened was that a bunch of lawyers, particularly lawyers from the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, a group of other lawyers, a couple of death penalty lawyers actually, Joe Margulies, who I believe spoke at an FFF conference, and Clive Stafford Smith, who had worked on the death penalty in New Orleans and is now based in London. Death penalty lawyers, I think, were pretty clued up about dealing with some of the extremes of the law, or cases where the law has become very blurred. And so lawyers from the very beginning tried to get involved, because they understood that there is no emergency that can be declared anywhere that allows you to hold people without any rights. And the great problem with Guantanamo was that there were people there who claimed that they had been seized by mistake, but were given no opportunity whatsoever to test the legality of their detention. Now, it took nearly 2.5 years of court battles before the Guantanamo cases came up before the Supreme Court, who granted the prisoners habeas corpus rights. And as a result of that, there were many problems with what happened after that, with the government's response, and some of those are discussed in the film. But essentially, the kind of closed nature, the total secrecy of Guantanamo was effectively broken at that point, because lawyers were allowed in to meet with the prisoners. And it's largely as a result of that some of the stories started to emerge from the prisoners themselves about the ways that they'd been treated. And I hope you'll find when we watch the film that Tom Wilner, who's a lawyer in Washington, D.C., who was very involved from the very beginning, explains very well all about this. Where I kind of became involved was that I about 4 years ago, started to become increasingly annoyed about the fact that I wanted to know who was in Guantanamo, but that no information was available. The government had still not even told the world the names and the nationalities of the men who were held there. And I started my research by going through available documentation about people who'd been released, primarily, going through news reports dating back to 2002, when the very first prisoners were released from Guantanamo. A few people were sent back to Afghanistan in November 2002. A man who was about pushing 90 years old, I think, was one of them. And I went through the stories of prisoners who'd been released from Britain and from other European countries, because these people in particular had started to tell more detailed accounts of what had happened to them. And where I really became, when I decided I was going to commit myself kind of full time to this, I was fortunate that at the time that happened, a lawsuit was won by various newspapers and the Associated Press, and the Pentagon was forced to release the names and the nationalities of the prisoners, and moreover was obliged to release 8,000 pages of documents. Now, these were the allegations against the prisoners that had been compiled by the Pentagon over the previous few years. And it also included the transcripts of the tribunals that had been held at Guantanamo to ascertain whether these people had been correctly designated as enemy combatants when they were captured, and as a result could continue to be held without charge or trial. Now, there were many problems with this process which was established, which is also discussed in the film, so I'll try not to duplicate too much. But when the Supreme Court gave habeas corpus rights to the Guantanamo prisoners, which was an unusual, an unprecedented thing to do in wartime. Prisoners in wartime are supposed to be held in a prisoner of war camp, protected from inhumane treatment, and held until the end of hostilities. And had that been the case, we would now be sitting around and we would, I suspect, have lawyers saying, how long is this war going to last? But because that didn't happen, and because these men had no way of asking why they were being held, it was why the Supreme Court gave them habeas corpus rights and intended the US courts to be available to them, to come to the courts, to have lawyers represent them and say, tell us your case, why are you holding this man? Well, the government actually, because the Bush administration didn't really want to listen to what anybody told them to do, including the Supreme Court of the United States, introduced these tribunals instead, which allowed the prisoners to tell their side of the story, but essentially in response to these allegations where they weren't told where the allegations came from. There was secret evidence that they weren't allowed to see. They weren't allowed legal representation. It was a sham. There have been a few good people who've come forward over the years. Started in June 2007 with Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Abraham, who had worked on the tribunals, who exposed what a one-sided sham the whole process was. It was designed to rubber stamp the fact that these guys are enemy combatants and could be held without rights. But what it did allow, at least, was for the prisoners to tell their stories, and hundreds of them did. And hundreds of them responded to the allegations that were put against them by saying, well, no, I don't know where you got that from. That's not the truth at all. And so what I did with all this material was to put it together in, I actually kind of established, a database is rather too fine a word for it, because it was just a whole sequence of Word documents where I listed prisoners by nationality and transcribed their stories, and then began to put together a chronology, which was, I think, the key, really, for me to understand who the Guantanamo prisoners were, because we were told by the administration that they were the worst of the worst and they were all seized on the battlefield. Well, it turns out that, at least 85% of them weren't captured on the battlefield at all. Were not captured by US forces, were captured by the US military's Afghan or Pakistani allies at a time when bounty payments averaging $5,000 a head were being paid for Al-Qaeda and Taliban suspects. And I was able to break down the places that the prisoners were caught to understand that a large number of the prisoners were caught in cities in Pakistan that were a considerable distance from the battlefield, and to realize that a lot of these men were pulled off buses or were seized in raids on mosques, or there was a whole sequence of house raids that took place, one after another of them pulling people out of these houses and sending them to Guantanamo. And when I compared and contrasted stories, I was seeing the same things happening, that the Pakistani police or military would be doing the raid, but there would be one or two Americans. And the Pakistanis quietly on the side would be apologizing to these prisoners and saying, we're sorry this is happening to you, but we have to keep sweet with the Americans. And all of these most of these raids seem to have been the product of extremely dubious intelligence, because over time some of these stories have come out. And the most famous of the Pakistani stories was probably a man called Adele Hassan Hamid, a Sudanese hospital administrator who'd been living in Pakistan for 17 years. He has some very enterprising lawyers who actually made a short film about him and put it out on YouTube and set up a website to campaign for his release, which may have contributed to him finally being released in December 2007. But his lawyers had been out to Sudan and had investigated his story, and then had spoken to him extensively in Guantanamo as well, and had discovered that what had happened was that the local Pakistani police or the army had been stealing supplies from his warehouse, and so he had complained about it. And so when the war on terror comes along and Arabs can be handed over as terror suspects, these guys got their own back on him and pointed him out to US forces and said, he's Al-Qaeda, send him to Guantanamo. And that's just one of many stories. But that's really how I was enabled really to take the whole picture apart and put it in context, to understand really how such big mistakes had been made. And that led to me writing the book, The Guantanamo Files, which, as Jacob kindly pointed out, I have some copies of on sale. And I followed that up with carrying on writing about Guantanamo. What actually happened was that after I handed in the manuscript in May 2007, a prisoner died in Guantanamo under still unexplained circumstances. 7 prisoners have died in Guantanamo. 1 died of untreated cancer. The other 6 have reportedly been suicides, but there's always been some doubt about them. But this Saudi man died in Guantanamo. From my background information, I had something of the story of this man. And I approached various newspapers and said, would you like some background information on the story of this man who's died? And kind of people got back to me and said, no, we're just going to run with these few lines from the Associated Press, that's fine. So I thought, okay, well, how do I get this story out? So I started blogging. And then I started approaching other websites because I realized as soon as I started writing, then I'm watching the news and the more stories are coming. So that's how I really got into writing about it. And approached websites who were prepared to, who happily understood, here's a guy who's trying to expose a story that isn't really being talked about enough. There have been some good stories in the mainstream media, but often I think they lack detail, and I think the lack of continuity it effectively contributes to a situation where news comes and goes in people's minds. They're not encouraged to join the dots particularly. And one of the things that I've been really kind of heartened by over the last few years of writing intensely on this topic and finding more and more places like the Future of Freedom Foundation that are happy to print my work online, is that the online community is gaining in strength. More and more people are coming to the internet to look for the detail behind the stories that they're not finding in the mainstream media. And it's a very exciting time, I think, for news on the internet. And I'm hoping we're going to see some good developments, actually, over the coming year. I think there are going to be more entrepreneurs, more people who can provide backing, who can provide money, who will be able to invest in genuinely good news reporting, investigative reporting as well, on the internet, and that it's a kind of new model that's developing. I very much hope that's going to happen. The film that we're going to see was broadly based on the book, because the narrative that I'd been able to establish by finding out who are all these guys and where were they seized, I thought was a very important part of the story, to explain that although a lot of people were seized in Afghanistan, it's clear that not all of those people went there because they were fighting. There were people from the Gulf countries in particular who took the charitable obligations of Islam very seriously. And I know that within Guantanamo, the US military was surprised. And a lot of people outside of Islam are surprised that, there are in certain countries, in particular, I'm thinking of Kuwait as an example, where a lot of people go and work in humanitarian aid as missionaries. It's not considered appropriate just to give a small donation. To really do the good thing is to actually go out and provide help and assistance to people. And this was certainly part of the problem with what happened in Afghanistan, was that Arabs who were there after 9/11 were of course regarded as terrorists, or at least as people who had been recruited to fight with the Taliban. Whereas in fact, clearly this wasn't the case. There were people who were there for other reasons. And people who traveled after 9/11, when there's a humanitarian disaster after the US-led invasion, it was particularly hard on them, because you arrived after 9/11 in the United States, you must have come to join the fight against the United States. And, in a lot of cases that wasn't true. So in an attempt to provide an insight into some elements of the story, my co-director, Polly, who would love to be here but is in London, and I'm having to come out and do all this on her behalf as well. She would love to be here. We tried to arrange a plan that would tell the story, that would incorporate these various elements of the story. So prisoners who were captured in Afghanistan, prisoners who were captured in Pakistan, and we also wanted to include the other, even darker part of the story, if you like, which is prisoners who were held in a variety of other secret prisons, who were subjected to extraordinary rendition, and who went to places where that were very clearly focused on torture for the purposes of interrogation. I wouldn't like to give you the impression for a minute that torture wasn't part of the fabric of Guantanamo, because I think it is on many different levels. And just to talk briefly about that, I would say that there was a particularly gruesome period in Guantanamo for a couple of years when the enhanced interrogation techniques were introduced, which were reverse engineered from the techniques that are taught in US military schools to teach US personnel to resist interrogation when captured. You know, we normally hear about those being applied to the high-value detainees who were held in secret CIA prisons, the men like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, others accused of actual involvement in the 9/11 attacks. But what's clear from Guantanamo is that at least 1 in 6 of the prisoners who were held there were subjected to various permutations of these techniques, which involved prolonged sleep deprivation, 20-hour interrogations with just 4 hours allowed for sleep that went on and on, prolonged isolation, being held in cells where the air conditioning was turned up either very high or very low, so they were incredibly hot or freezing cold, forced nudity, playing on people's phobias, so the use of dogs, attempts to sexually humiliate people, painful shackling, short shackling in positions where they were held for hours that was agonizing. And all these kind of techniques were applied together in all of these cases. And I think that was probably Guantanamo's darkest period. But overall, you know, the great problem with that prison is that it now appears to be run in a more orthodox manner, and it resembles a prison. It resembles prisons in the US mainland. It was actually, you know, the blocks that they built there after the initial animal cages, Camp X-Ray, that they held people in. Those permanent blocks were modeled on blocks in particular US prisons. But, you know, the great difference between them and anybody held in a US prison is that these guys have never been tried. They've never been charged. They never had a trial. They never had a judge hand down a sentence to them. And every morning they wake up not knowing if ever they'll be released from that place. And it's that particular psychological burden that you know, I like to try and get across to people of imagine being in that position. If you commit a crime, you know, and a judge says that's 10 years, you have a finite amount of time. Even if somebody says life, you know that, and they mean it, you know that. Not knowing, you know, what's going to happen to you and never having had a trial is just appalling. And one of, Polly managed to find a quote from the International Committee of the Red Cross that we use in the film, which representatives of the International Committee of the Red Cross visit prisoners all around the world, and the reason that they're allowed access across the board is that they promise not to talk about the conditions. It's the kind of trade-off of, even with terrible regimes, having access to the prisoners, is that they won't reveal any dark truths about what's going on. But the International Committee of the Red Cross actually spoke out publicly in 2003 and said the open-ended nature of the detention at Guantanamo, we are really deeply concerned about the effect that this is having on the mental health of the prisoners. And that was in 2003. You know, we're now in 2009, 6 years later, and the same thing is happening. And the other aspect of Guantanamo that I still find, you know, deeply troubling concerns hunger strikes and what happens to people who are involved in the most minor infractions of the rules. Hunger strikes have been always used throughout Guantanamo's history as, I think, a way of people who have no other way of expressing their anger and their frustration about the way that they're held. And there was a huge hunger strike in 2005 at the prison, and the authorities responded by ordering in restraint chairs where people are strapped in. I think they use 18 different straps, 3 across the head, and are then force-fed by a tube that's put up their nose and into their stomach twice a day. And these are still going on. There are still dozens of prisoners on a hunger strike at Guantanamo. And when prisoners don't want to be fed, and in fact, whenever prisoners break the rules slightly, which might be, you know, not standing in quite the right place, in the cell when the guards come round, they have a thing called the emergency reaction force, or the immediate reaction force, which is 5 heavily armed guys who come around and pepper spray the prisoner in the face and then beat him up. And it's all still happening on a regular basis. So, you know, these are, I think, the particularly distressing elements that I find about Guantanamo just now. And what does disappoint me about the amount of time that it is taking the Obama administration to reach any effective decisions about the prisoners who are held there, finding ways to release prisoners who should not still be held there. I was going to talk about this afterwards, but as I seem to have led myself into this particular area, then before we watch the film, maybe I'll just talk about a few of these things, because when President Bush finally left the White House, he left somewhere between 50 and 60 prisoners in Guantanamo who had been cleared for release. The language the administration uses is approved for transfer. But military review boards, the follow-up to the tribunals I was talking about, these review boards every year would review the prisoners' cases and decide whether the men should still be held or whether they could be sent home, either to their home country or to another country. And so there were 50 to 60 of these guys who had been, some of them sitting there for several years when Bush left office, who couldn't be returned home, most of them. Most of them couldn't be returned home because the countries that they're from have such terrible human rights records that they were at danger of being tortured or arbitrarily imprisoned or subjected to a show trial. There is, of course, an irony considering how they'd been treated while they've been in Guantanamo. But at least the Bush administration, for the most part, didn't try and break those international treaties that prevent people being returned to countries where they face the risk of torture. But prisoners from Algeria, from Libya, from Syria, from Tunisia, from China, from Uzbekistan were in this predicament. And many of those men are still in Guantanamo facing this same predicament. Other countries have not been found that will accept them. Now, what's happened, obviously, is that with a new president who is certainly slightly more prepared to engage with the United States allies around the world than the Bush administration, which used to really become kind of childishly petulant when talking to other countries that weren't helping them out by taking prisoners. There's more goodwill towards President Obama, and there's a handful of European countries that have promised to take a few of these guys, and there's a handful of European countries that have actually delivered. A couple of Uzbeks went to Ireland over the summer. A man was released to Belgium recently. 2 Syrians are now living in Portugal. Another prisoner went to France. There have been a few examples. And of the Chinese prisoners, the Uyghurs, 4 men were sent to Bermuda in June, and just 2 weeks ago, another 6 were sent to Palau. I had to look it up, and my joke, rather dark joke about that, is that the moon was busy, but there was some space on Palau, because how far away do you have to send these poor men who are innocent? I'm very disappointed that, that President Obama didn't bring these men to the United States. The Bush administration was ordered to bring the Uyghurs to the United States last autumn. And just to give a brief recap, these are 22 guys who were captured fleeing Pakistan, like everybody else who was rounded up, and they were all bundled up as Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and sent to Guantanamo. Well, everybody knew pretty much from the beginning that these guys only had one enemy, which was the Chinese government, and they'd fled oppression in China and had no involvement with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And the Bush administration had accepted this in the case of some of these men, 5 of these men, and had, in 2006, after scouring the world, had persuaded Albania to take 5 of them. But since then, nothing had happened. No other country wanted to help out. And last October, the men finally got in front of a judge who was looking at their habeas corpus petition. Looking at the reasons why the government said that it had the right to hold these men. And what had actually happened a few months before that is that one man had had his case reviewed by a court. I won't get into the technical details of how various courts were looking at things at various times, but one of these men had had his case looked at by an appeals court, a panel of 3 judges, 2 conservatives and a liberal, who had shredded the government's supposed evidence. They had actually compared it to a nonsense poem by Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And in the months that followed, leading up to the petition of the other 16 men that the judge was going to look at, just down the road, the District of Columbia District Court, the government gave up and said, we're not going to contest this. So the judge, Ricardo Urbina, in early October last year, said, right, what we have here is, you're not contesting this, so what we have here are innocent men. You have had a long time to find another country for them and you can't find one. We all agree that they can't be returned to China. Holding them here in Guantanamo, innocent men, is unconstitutional. There is only one solution to this. I order you to bring them to my courtroom next Friday, and we will find new homes for them, because plans had been prepared by the Uyghur community in Washington, D.C., and by another community in Tallahassee, Florida. And the Bush administration appealed, and a panel of judges in the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, which includes a judge called Judge Randolph, who is famous for having agreed with every piece of law that was put in front of him that the Bush administration dreamt up, which was later overturned by the Supreme Court. These judges said, no, absolutely not. There's no way that a district court judge can order these men to be brought to the United States. These are immigration questions. It's up to the executive. So then President Obama comes in, and then a full panel of this appeals court looks at the Uyghurs' case. And instead of backing down, they did exactly the same thing that the Bush administration had done and said, no, it's up to us and we don't want these guys brought to the United States. And it isn't just the Court of Appeals that did that. I think having failed to seize the initiative, which President Obama really should have done, because if you want to go and have a look up the Uyghurs in Bermuda, and you will see these guys who are now working on a golf course out in Bermuda, and I can guarantee that had they been brought to Washington, D.C., it would have been the clearest example provided to the American people of here are men who were wrongly imprisoned, who were wrongly detained, who should never have been held, and the United States government has done the right thing by making amends to them instead of trying to fob them off somewhere else. But it didn't happen. And as part of it not happening, it also allowed the lawmakers in Congress of both parties, I have to say, a significant number of Democrats, to start resurrecting the kind of fear-mongering that Dick Cheney made his career out of doing by talking about how Guantanamo was full of terrorists and getting us back to that same point of what are we talking about? We haven't reviewed their cases properly. We've got men who've been cleared. We've got so many who've been released. How can you still keep talking about them as terrorists? But the lawmakers all, got together and over the course of this year have stipulated in law that no cleared prisoner can be brought to the US mainland under any circumstances, throwing it back on Europe to clean up the mess. It got particularly bad a few months ago where it looked as though they were actually going to stop any Guantanamo prisoners being brought to the US mainland for any reason. And the administration wants to bring prisoners to the US mainland so it can close Guantanamo and so it can put some of these men on trial finally. So that's the kind of difficult position that we're in now with 2.5 months to go before the closure of Guantanamo. And all the figures don't add up. What's going to happen on January the 22nd, 2010 is that there are going to be men stuck there who can't be returned home and for whom no country has been found, no country will be found. And I think this is going to go on. And I think we could meet in a year's time and I could be telling you that the same thing is happening. The only bright light in all of this is that last week, Amherst in Massachusetts, the town of Amherst in Massachusetts, its council, they had a town hall meeting. The council in Massachusetts has decided that they are going to ask the Senate to reverse its ban on bringing cleared prisoners from Guantanamo to the US mainland, and has chosen 2 prisoners that they would like to bring to Amherst to settle them there. And otherwise, really genuinely, this is just going to run and run. And I know that most people don't care about it, but it's going to look bad to the rest of the world on January the 22nd, 2010, when Obama hasn't been able to meet his promise. I suspect we'll see something at the last minute. He may well get some people out of there. Quite possibly there'll be a deal with the Yemenis. The Yemenis make up nearly half the prisoners who are held there. And a lot of them have been cleared for release. But you know why they haven't wanted to send any of them back? Because it doesn't matter whether you've been cleared for release. They don't trust the Yemen, which is quite an unruly region. They don't trust what has happened to these men in Guantanamo, where they think they've been radicalized by their own experience in this prison. So they're saying, we're not letting them go unless they go through a rehabilitation program. I'm trying to imagine that you expand this to the criminal justice system, that somebody serves a sentence, even people who've been sentenced, and that you don't let them out at the end, you've got to go through a rehabilitation program. It's absurd. They may well send some of these Yemenis back so that in January it will look better because there will be less people in Guantanamo. But I think your help is required. I think look at what Amherst has done and talk about what Amherst has done. And I think communities around the country need to do the same thing and need to send the same message to the Senate, because otherwise the choice is really quite stark. Some men will stay in Guantanamo, very possibly for the rest of their lives, who have not done anything wrong, who were captured by mistake. And I don't know what the government intends to do with them. Are they going to give them a job in the naval base? Are they going to set up a small community where they're free to move about? But you know, that to me really is the kind of burning issue just now. And I think if you can look into what Amherst has done, and if you can kind of see the logic of this, I think this is what we're going to hear more in January when the deadline passes, and hopefully when a significant number of people say, what now then? What now? Because what we have at present are 215 men in Guantanamo. Next week, the government is probably going to announce how many people it intends to try. I would be very surprised if it's more than 40 people. That leaves 175 people in Guantanamo, and they need to either go home or they need to be given new homes so that we can all bring this terrible episode in American history to an end. Thank you for your patience.